Here we are, part 3 of chapter 9.0, Managing the Maze. Let's just go ahead and jump in. I think I just said part 3, and this is actually part 4, continuing our look at compliance. So, when we talk about data, we have to classify data and handle data differently depending on its risk to the organization. That's sort of the key, right? The role in risk management. So we also want to classify data because we don't want to have the cost, the expense, the auditing, etc., not to mention the backup costs and the costs when the data is in use or traversing the network in the aspect of encrypting data that we don't need to encrypt. Right? So data classification identifies the degree of harm to an organization, its stakeholders, or others that might result if the information is divulged, right? If the information is set out to the dark web. For example, 2.7 billion social security numbers stolen recently, right? Which we'll get into a little bit. So data classification levels look like this. Public data is essentially information that's intended to public disclosure. And if it's intended for public disclosure, we don't need to really secure it, right? Press releases, publicly available information on our website, etc., doesn't need that security. The website might need the security, but not the data, right? Internal or private, so this is information that's not intended for publicly release, but is not highly sensitive. Emails, and an email example here, might be an email that goes out from HR saying, hey, next week's payday, please make sure you fill out your timesheets and give us your leave information, etc. There's not much risk or harm to the organization, so we really don't need to worry about securing that data, right? But it's not public data. So hopefully that makes sense. So unauthorized disclosure of internal or private data could cause some inconvenience or minor financial loss of some sort. That brings us to confidential data. Now, here's where we get into thinking about encryption, thinking about more security, thinking about IPS, and IDS systems that manage and monitor this data, okay? So it's information that's more sensitive, could cause significant harm to the organization if disclosed without authorization, right? So customer records is a good example. Internal financial statements is another good example. And then further along is restricted. So notice some customer records may be here, while restricted and highly confidential may in fact be personal identifiable information of our employees and our customers. All right? So restricted or high confidential, this level is assigned to most sensitive data, okay? Where unauthorized disclosure could cause severe damage to the organization, its stakeholders, and its clients. So highest level, restricted data demands the highest level of security. We're getting into, further or more encryption, more physical security of the devices holding these data assets. So trade secrets, sensitive customer or employee information would fall underneath this. Now, a prototype project may fall between these two. Some aspects of the project may be restricted, such as drawings, etc., but other aspects, such as project documentation, may not be as restricted, but is still confidential. Right? We don't want that information getting out on a prototype product, because what if someone, we have an internal threat and that person steals that information, gives it to a competitor who produces that product or service before us? It could mean that our product isn't worth anything on the open market, right? Finally, the highest level, classified or sensitive information. We see this a lot in, military, government, etc. That's where we see this information that has been determined, to require protection against unauthorized disclosures. It's marked to indicate its classified status. And there are different levels of classified status. We don't need to get into that much detail here. Okay, but this might be a software company who is designing or managing a product or service for a government agency, and thus they have communications that are considered, classified. So they have to protect that data at the level. Now, briefly talked about this, but in the news, a wake-up call for information security. I couldn't help but not include this in the video. So here we are back in April 2024. Now, this was just released through a lawsuit, but this data breach, which happened to National Public Data, a company that collects and sells access to personal data for background checks, you know, criminal records, private investigations, whatever the case may be. Other people we won't get into, but this data gets hacked, right? 2.7 billion records were exposed. Those records included names, social security number, addresses, possible aliases, pretty much everything I need to commit identity fraud. Okay. Hacking group was US DOD, which is, I always laugh at that hacking group. Consequences highlights severe impact of inadequate security, right? Identity theft is the big thing here. There's enough information, it sounds like, in these records that if they somehow make their way out, if US DOD puts these on the dark web, if they haven't already, we're going to see a spike in identity theft and identity fraud, right? And this is not just about opening a loan or taking out a credit card. This can be processing your tax return a month before you process it. They do it fictitiously. A huge refund comes to the to the person committing the identity fraud. Then you file, and you've got all the challenges and problems in the world. So risks of data aggregation. So, data brokers aggregate all of this data and then sell it out, to people that want to use it, both maybe legitimately and fictitiously. I think if you're buying dark web data, it's got to be, not being used in a good way. So here's the unfortunate thing. So what should have happened? This organization should have further protected. They should have implemented multi-factor authentication, perhaps higher encryption, regular security audits to catch this in the moment, IDS, IPS, SIEM systems, whatever the case may be, right? Continuously monitoring, auditing. The problem is now the responsibility falls on people whose data was stolen as well. So as an individual who may have had your social security number stolen through this hack, you got to take proactive steps. If you're not using your credit, best step, freeze it. Nobody can take out a loan, can take out a credit card if your credit is frozen, okay? You need to use stronger passwords and unique passwords to protect yourself as well. You need to stay informed. You may decide to get credit protection, notice the difference, versus credit monitoring. Most of the time when companies are hacked, they give out credit monitoring. All credit monitoring is we're going to monitor your credit. You can do this through Credit Karma. That's what I use. And it monitors your credit for changes and then notifies you of the change. But by the time you get that change, that somebody's taken out a $100,000 loan as you, now the nightmare begins. And this is where credit protection comes in. Because you are, remember we're going to talk about risk. Well, we've talked about risk avoidance, right? So in talking about risk, we can transfer that risk with credit protection, which is essentially an insurance policy, funding and resources to help us rebuild or, prove that loan was not us. In addition to these classifications, we look at sensitivity. That's kind of how we measure. Sensitivity is a measure of importance assigned to the information by its owner for the purpose of denoting its need for protection. And of course, that can also come from laws and regulations that define minimal encryption levels, minimal transfer over network encryption, etc. Okay? Once we classify it, the next logical step is protection, using encryption, other security measures to protect the sensitive information, both internally, physically, logically, you name it, okay? And then methods of protection. Typically, encryption, access controls, policies, procedures, secure handling, etc. Now, that brings us to administrative controls. And essentially, administrative controls are controls implemented through policies and procedures. So we've got all this governance. We've got some compliance that we're talking about, and we create these administrative controls through policies and procedures to protect that data and create a good cybersecurity infrastructure. Okay? So administrative controls, also we integrate physical into this. So who has access to what? And I'm going to give you some examples of those in just a minute. In its role in GCR is pretty simple. It's essential components of an organization's governance, compliance, and risk strategies. This is where we manage and mitigate risk by dictating how measures are enforced. So a couple examples here, access control, right? A policy might require new users to receive approval from a hiring manager before accessing critical systems, and that makes perfect sense. Maybe we haven't finished a background check that we want to run before that happens. And then dual personnel. So my example here is in a data center that may collect credit card information, may collect data. The credit card information has a higher security level, okay? So whatever, level that is. We secure those servers inside an even more secure physical section of the data center. Okay, so it's a smaller section where data is stored, such as credit card information, PII, whatever the case may be. Well, to access that cage, if you will, there needs to be two people. Now, it doesn't tend to be two people from the same department, such as the IT department going in and managing servers, replacing hard drives, doing whatever. This can be someone from IT who is monitored by a security agent. And the reason for this is so that we don't get collusion. We don't get two people who decide to steal data. A lot of times this means if a hard drive is replaced, that hard drive can't leave that cage without a thorough process, and in some cases can't leave that cage till it's thoroughly destroyed. Stick it under a chop saw, and then it can leave the cage. Okay? So protecting that data from inception to retirement of the data. So integration with other controls, administrative controls are frequently used alongside physical and technical controls. Okay? The example here, an equipment room, might involve a policy limiting access to authorized personnel with technical controls enforced, right? This might be, again, biometric authentication from a physical side. So once we do all this, well, we got to have enforcement and monitoring. So we have auditing to make sure policies are, in fact, being implemented. If there's not, there's some sort of enforcement. This could be writing someone up for not following policy and procedure all the way to termination, depending on how many times they haven't, or the degree of failure by the person, by a department, whatever the case may be. Okay? So we constantly monitor, we constantly change. We know threats are evolving. We have to constantly evolve our cybersecurity strategy as well. So that is going to do it for part 4. In part 5, we're going to get off of compliance and hit the last section, which is risk management. We'll see you then.